He stepped through the glass like an omen, shoulders wider than the doorway, a coat the color of midnight oil, eyes that held the arithmetic of threats and the precise patience of someone who'd learned to wait out storms. Conversation tapered into the hush people make for knives. Cups halted midway to lips. A teenager, wiping a booth with more courage than sense, clutched the rag like a talisman. Men who would cross oceans for him made space as if gravity had bowed toward his boots. And then he ordered a grilled cheese and a cup of black coffee, the kind of small human thing that should have been invisible, except it was not. It detonated across the diner like a confession. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. The waitress who heard his order kept bleaching the same spot on the counter for 3 heartbeats longer than necessary. Elena Russo had been on shift long enough to read people at a glance. Fabric of desperation, the angle of a jaw set against bargaining, the tiny, involuntary reveals that gave a life away in the way someone tucked their hands into their pockets. Salvatore Marcello, Don Salvatore to headlines and the whispering mouths in the alleyways, had the look of a man who had chosen violence as a language and learned to speak it fluently. Yet his choices at that moment, a grilled cheese and coffee, no extras, no theatrics, spoke softer dialects. They confused her, but not enough to make her bow. She slid the plate to him like sliding a key across a countertop. Her hands bore the industry of the kitchen. Calluses on knuckles, a thin white scar near the wrist where a knife had slipped during a dinner rush years ago. She did not flinch from him. She treated his presence like any other order, like a ledger to be counted and cleared. There was defiance in that steadiness, not arrogance. It was, in its own way, a small kind of mercy. "You're not what I thought," he said. Not loud enough to disturb the bubble of silence around his booth, but clear enough for her, the one with a name tag that read Elena in neat, practical letters. The sound of his voice carried the weight of reputations, an obliging undertow that made knees weaker somewhere behind the counter. "People aren't menu items," she replied. Her answer was a blunt slice of humor, a shield as much as a jest, because politeness could be used like currency in rooms where every kindness was investigated for its price. He smiled, the fraction of a smile that asked for none of what the world expected. "And grilled cheese is fine," she added, because someone had to say it. He watched her watch him, as if examining a new specimen. The diner hummed back to life around them. The fryer hissed, a jukebox sputtered out a song nowhere near his era, but perfectly appropriate for the light that slid across the formica. He ate like a man who had forgotten how to be small, and then remembered with surprise how good it could feel. Each bite seemed to take nothing and everything from him. She found herself watching the way he cradled the paper cup. There were rings around the inside, fingerprints that told of too many late nights, and, perhaps, the habit of solving problems at the bottom of a mug. "How long you been at Russo's?" he asked, after a silence long enough to become a thing between them. "Too long," she said, which could mean how long since she'd last had a proper night's sleep, or how long since she stopped hoping the world would hand her anything without it being costed first. Elena had answers like this ready for men with one foot in trouble and the other in danger. Salvatore didn't press. He only nodded, as if the cost had intrigued him. "Your hands," he said, softer, as he pushed his plate away. "Scars from the kitchen?" "From life," she corrected. She wanted to stop there, because the truth was a folder of complications. A younger brother, Marco, who counted her shifts like piggy bank days. A father who had taught her to siphon stubbornness from the earth. A promise to never be bait again. Saying more would be like laying out accounts with a capo, unnecessary reckoning. Salvatore folded the napkin and handed it back with a movement precise enough to be ceremonial. "You look like you carry a ledger," he said instead, "and you do not add me to it." The honesty in his voice felt like a coin being flipped between strangers. Elena thought of the men who kept ledgers close, entries for favors owed, names yellowing with age, the weight of decisions that decided who lived and who was sent away. She could imagine his ledger heavy and ink-smudged. She could not imagine him liking grilled cheese. She cleared the dishes when he left and cleaned the same spot on the counter again until the rag threatened to fray. At some point, an older regular, the kind of man who traded gossip for coffee, sidled to her and said the name the entire block had whispered all week. "That's Salvatore Marcello in there. 2 nights before the truce. That's brave." "Or stupid," Eleanor murmured, scraping crumbs into a palm. She tasted metal on her tongue, whether from the smell of fear or the memory of her father's disappearance, she couldn't tell. In the back, the kitchen clattered like a small war. Elena worked 2 jobs because one would have made a ledger too tempting to the wrong eyes. Marco was small for his 14 years, but not small enough to be invisible. He had the quick hands of a kid who'd learned how to lift spirits when wallets were light, how to mend a hem, how to hide from collections with a map made of shadows. She'd promised their mother, before the city swallowed her in a raid 3 cycles ago, that she'd keep Marco away from the maps and the men who read them. That promise often felt like a rope around her throat. When she stepped outside for a cigarette break after her shift, the night felt thinner than usual, as if the city had pulled back a blanket to study them. 2 men in an unmarked car watched the diner. Not men she recognized. Their faces were practiced, their patience trained like snipers. Elena shrank into the doorway and felt her stomach do that slow, dropping thing it did when fear remembered its name. She told herself she was being careful because she had a brother at home who loved comic books and burned sugar into pancakes like breakfast was a crime they didn't plan to stop committing. She dodged the men and walked home along the alleys, where the graffiti told stories their mothers would never know, where the trash had accents. When she reached the tenement she shared with Marco, she found something that made her blink twice. A plain white envelope, pushed under the door, no return address, no stamps, only a single sentence written in heavy black ink. "We will see you at sundown Thursday. T." Her first thought was Tomas Belmond, the name as bitter to her ears as ash. Tomas was the capo who had once been Salvatore's most reliable shadow. Ambition had stretched him thin until he frayed at the edges, and ambition's teeth had begun to find new purchase. He had a knack for finding weak seams, men with debts, men who liked the idea of power more than the cost. Tomas's message could be a rehearsal, a prelude meant to unsettle the domestic rhythm Elena desperately kept. Or it could be worse, a demand wrapped in the courtesy of a threat. She folded the paper into the small pocket inside her jacket and felt the smoothness of its threat like a second skin. Marco asked where she'd been, and she said, working late, like it was a story that could be repeated without consequence. But the envelope had broader teeth. It didn't only speak to Elena the waitress. It spoke to Elena the woman who lived near a war that was planning a truce in 2 days' time. In the newspaper, truce meant negotiations and paper agreements. On the street, it smelled like blood held in check by hands that did not always keep promises. On Thursday evening, the diner filled. The truce would ripple through the neighborhood, bringing men in suits and men with rosaries, and men who liked both the suits and the rosaries. Elena found herself watching the door as if it might impart wisdom on how to remain invisible while being visible to the people who counted her as leverage. When Salvatore walked in again, this time with an entourage trimmed like a shadow, the room breathed intransitively. He sat in the same booth as before, ordered a coffee without looking at the menu, and asked for Elena the way someone asks for a book from a shelf they've been meaning to read. It felt like a summons, but softer, something that asked for kindness without the usual subcontracted threats. "Stay after," he said quietly as she refilled his cup, the steam fogging the air between them into a private winter. "I'll walk you to your door." Elena's first instinct was to laugh, short and bitter. He did not need to walk her to her door. The city, efficient in its cruelties, had taught her how to walk fast and mean. But when she looked at him, at the man whose name could make the police station look like a chapel and make Tomas look like a boy with a dangerous density of greed, she saw something that looked suspiciously like concern. Or perhaps it was convenience. Men like him had many languages, and concern often masqueraded as strategy. "Why would I want a guard?" she asked, folding the napkin in her hand into a small plane. "Because there's an envelope for you," he said, as if telling her that the room had sprung a leak and someone needed to catch the water. "Because someone thinks you are useful for reasons that have nothing to do with what you want." To take favors from a man like Salvatore was to sign a ledger in invisible ink, but to refuse could be carved by itself into consequences. Elena's life had been a series of choices between bad things and worse ones. She told herself she could walk home alone. She also noticed, with the merciless clarity of someone who understood leverage, that the two men in the unmarked car had not left. Someone was drawing a line, and the line had a name on it. Her dilemma narrowed like a scope: keep her independence and risk what she couldn't name, or accept his attention and bind herself to a world she had promised her mother she'd avoid. She had sworn against being bait. She had also sworn to keep Marco alive. Sometimes those vows braided together into knots, and sometimes they didn't. "Give me 5 minutes," she said finally. It was an answer halfway between a surrender and a bargain. Salvatore inclined his head like a man closing a business deal, and, for the first time, there was something like a softness in it. It unsettled her more than it comforted. As she clocked out and stepped into the night with him at her side, Elena felt the city's breath on her face and the ledger of her life press against her ribs. 2 nights before the truce, the scales shifted. A Don who ate grilled cheese and a waitress who refused titular fear had made space in a world that believed power must always glitter. Neither of them yet understood how quickly the smallest decisions would redraw their maps. But by the time they reached the corner, the line between protection and possession had already begun to blur, and Elena had to decide how much ground she could afford to lose without her brother losing everything. Salvatore walked beside her the way a coastline walks beside an ocean, patient, steady, a presence that could swallow storms if it wanted, but chose instead to keep the horizon clear. He did not try to smooth her questions with small talk. The city pressed against them from both sides, its light a jaundiced, impatient thing. Neon flickered over damp pavement. A couple argued under the awning of a laundromat, and a child laughed like a coin dropped into a fountain. Elena kept her eyes forward. The familiar ache in her calves was a compass more honest than the one her chest offered. "You shouldn't take walks with powerful men you don't know," she said, because rules had edges that kept her safe. "You shouldn't assume I am powerful in the way you think," he replied. He said it without malice, the truth of it folded into his tone like a blade kept from showing. Power likes to explain itself. I do not. It perfumes itself. Sometimes it shows its teeth. Other times it orders grilled cheese. She let a corner of a laugh escape, a bird that startled at its own noise. "Is that your philosophy? Eat simply to confuse people?" He glanced at her, the streetlight catching the hard planes of his face, and something like a grin loosened. Sometimes simplicity is honesty. That answer satisfied her no more than his presence did. A man who understood the currency of fear could make smallness look like confession. Elena thought of her father, who had said once that men like that kept kindness on a leash because they did not trust it would return. She wanted to ask Salvatore whether he trusted it. She wanted also not to know the answer. They reached the corner where the alleys bent and the city narrowed into whispers. For a moment, the walk felt like a negotiation. Each step a concession, each silence a possible ambush. Salvatore stopped and turned to her in a way that made her consider how much of herself was already open in his gaze. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, "or to be at the door when you get home?" She framed the choice, autonomy or safety, and found it a poor menu. "Neither," she said finally. "Just tell me why a man like you is choosing grilled cheese over caviar." He made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "Because it tastes like something my mother used to make," he said, and the answer sat between them, a soft thing that did not belong to the streets. For a moment, Elena glimpsed a memory of a man without the dawn, a man capable of tender glances and small domestic worships. It made him human. It did not make him harmless. "You're sentimental about lunch?" she teased, unable to keep the edge to her voice from softening. "I am sentimental about people who can make an honest sandwich," he replied, "and about people who lay down boundaries even when it would be easier to sell them." His eyes found hers. For the first time since they'd met, the question was not about territory or threat. It was narrower, intimate, in a way that felt dangerous because of how ordinary it was. Elena had trained herself to read ordinary things as potential traps. She wanted to believe him, if only because belief is a warm thing in a city that spent its nights freezing souls into bargains. When she opened the door to their building, the hallway smelled of oil and old summer. Marco's light was on in the tiny living room, and voices from the television seeped through the walls like gossip. Elena felt a small, fierce relief that was almost childlike in its purity. She moved with the practiced speed of a woman who had learned to measure the seconds between heartbeats and decisions. "Let me at least make sure you get to the door," Salvatore said. She hesitated, because the man at her side had the power to rewrite the margins of her life with a signature smudged in someone else's blood. To accept his escort was to accept a debt he might one day choose to collect. To refuse his offer might invite curiosity no kitchen rag could clean. 5 minutes, she said. It was a bargain she meant to keep with herself rather than to him. They waited on the stoop, bodies close enough that their jackets brushed. The city around them was a living map of wants. A car idled at the curb, and for a flicker of a second, Elena heard the echo of the men she'd spotted the night before. Her muscles tightened. Salvatore watched the street with a face that was both a barricade and an instrument, an expression she had seen before on men who planned sieges. "You're tired," he said abruptly, as if he had decided to press on a vulnerable place. "And you carry too much." "That's a skill," she answered, and the words were sharper than she intended. "Someone has to carry the groceries." "Aren't you tired of carrying other people's groceries?" he asked. The question landed with the gravity of an accusation and the softness of a plea. "You don't look like the kind of woman who wants to be weighed down." Her hands went to the hem of her jacket, to the envelope in the inner pocket like a second heartbeat. She had kept the paper because she was stubborn. She had kept it because she had thought, absurdly at first, and then with more frequency, that someone might care who was sending it. She had kept it like a bruised memory, and Salvatore's voice made the bruise ache. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "You told me you had a ledger," he countered. "You didn't tell me what was on it. But you had the look of someone who keeps receipts for the world. That tells me something." She swallowed. She could spin him stories of a mother taken in a raid, of a father who'd gone missing, of a brother who believed in better breakfasts. She could also tell the truth, that she had enemies she could not face without putting Marco in front of them like a shield, that Tomas's handwriting had the lazy cruelty of a man who liked to test the limits of promises by making them personal. She didn't. People like Salvatore collected confessions and stored them in vaults with colder doors than any bank. She had learned, painfully, to keep keys for herself. "Walk me to the door," she said once more. "Don't make me promise things I can't keep." He nodded like a man who collected bargains the way others collected coins. "I won't make you promise," he said, "but I will make sure you get home." The next day, the diner hummed with the rumble of the truce's approach. Men in suits traded glances like currency. Tomas Belmont's presence was a punctuation mark in the room, confident, polished, the kind of man whose charm felt like an engineered tool. He occupied a booth with ease, eyes sliding over the customers like a man reading headlines. Elena felt the room tilt when he walked in. She had known Tomas before he wore the cape of Amelia's newest hope of ascendancy. He'd been a guy who played cards at the orbit of the Marcello family and laughed with the teeth of a man practicing his smile. Ambition had sharpened him until his jokes became instruments. Tomas caught her eye from a distance and lifted his cup in a small, theatrical toast. His smile was the kind that smelled of promises wrapped in barbed wire. "That's our Tomas," an older woman at the counter whispered to Elena. "Big plans." "Big enough to swallow neighborhoods," Elena muttered back. When Tomas slid into the booth nearest the counter, it felt deliberate. He ordered the strongest espresso and watched Elena move like a predatory sun watching the tide. She felt the hair at the back of her neck stand up in a row of nervous combs. Tomas had the kind of attention that made women either change their names or change neighborhoods. She forced herself to stay calm, to put on the mask that kept the house upright. "Careful with your steps," Tomas said when she brought his drink. His voice was honey and steel. "Dangerous nights with the truce coming, no?" Elena kept her hand steady. "All nights are dangerous. Different kinds of dangerous, same result." He smiled, in a way that meant there was a ledger being balanced and invoices being blamed on coincidence. "You know, the city changes when deals get made," he said softly. "Sometimes it takes small people to make large changes." Elena's shoulders bristled. "I don't make changes for people who threaten me." Tomas' gaze slid to the doorway where Salvatore had taken his table. There was a storm in that look, not of lightning, but of simmering plans. "Sometimes threats are invitations," he said. "Sometimes they're just instruments of negotiation." The words were a blade parading as courtesy. Elena knew the sentiment's shape. Tomas liked to make emotional investments in other people's fear. The man wanted to unsettle her. He was testing the seam, seeing how far he could pry without spilling secrets. "Your invitations are poorly timed," she told him. He leaned in, the espresso steam painting him like a man who had mastered the art of threat subtlety. "Timing is everything," he said, "and some people are worth the schedule." Elena met his gaze and thought of Marco and the envelope, and every night she'd spent calculating whether to buy more milk or to keep a silence that tasted like guilt. She thought of Salvatore, who'd somehow become an island of unexpected kindness in a sea of expected currency. Her scales teetered, her ledger swayed. "Is this about me?" she asked, because to make it about herself was to take away the spectacle from the predator. Tomas's smile widened. "It's always about you," he said, and the words fell like a verdict rather than a compliment. Later that night, when Marco came home from a friend's with a new comic tucked under his arm and a grin that made her tired joy feel dangerous for its own daring, Elena found a new note slipped into the frame of their door. It wasn't as literate as Thomas's handwriting, angular, impatient, but the message had the same teeth. Keep your girl close. T. Her fingers turned white around the paper. Marco saw the change in her face, and for the first time in months, the boy looked at her not as the implacable provider, but as a woman standing on an edge. "You okay?" he asked. She crouched to be at his level, inhaled the smell of his hair, the warm, childish tang of fries in late afternoons, and told the smallest truth she could. "There's someone buying things for us we don't want," she said. "Don't take any money from anyone you don't know." He nodded like a small soldier. "Okay, I won't." But the note had been a stone thrown into a well, and its ripples would not stop. Elena lay awake that night, listening to the city breathe and Salvatore's words from their walk replaying in her ears. He had promised protection without demands. Thomas had promised nothing, but had offered everything in the rhythms of a man who loved making other people's lives theatrical. Elena's ledger, the lists she carried of what she owed and what had been taken, suddenly felt like a map someone else could read and use for their own ends. She realized, with a clarity that made her chest feel too tight, that the stakes had moved from negotiation to selection. People were choosing her like property. The push and the pull tightened. The city was getting ready to make decisions for them. Elena, who had built a life on being unseen, was refusing the role. She would not be bait. She would also not hand Marco to the collection plates of men who enjoyed bureaucracy with blood. The choices were ugly and precise. She had to decide whether to hold her ground and risk the hands that could make answers for her, or to lean toward an offer that smelled of safety but might be a shackled peace. Outside, Salvatore closed his eyes once, as if the world had become a tuning fork. He had noticed Thomas at the diner, and he had noticed the way Thomas looked at Elena. He'd noticed the note tucked into her door, because men like him were illegible to their own hearts until someone placed a simple sandwich in front of them and it became a scripture. That grilled cheese had been a test he didn't know he was running. It had yielded a woman who kept her courage close and who feared becoming a bargaining chip. It had also revealed, in the plainest stroke, the city choosing sides. In the small hours before dawn, Elena made a decision that was not made from courage so much as from the logic of survival. She would not accept gifts that came with strings. She would not be used. But she also could not see Marco injured for her principled stubbornness. The world offered trade-offs like poisonous fruit. She would have to invent a way to cleave her promises from the city's appetite for blood. She wrapped the notes in a small stack and carried them to the sink, the paper softening under the flow of water like secrets losing their edges. She did not wash away the messages. She kept them damp and heavy on the counter, letting them cool in the silence, because one day she would need to show someone the exact words that had been spoken to her. The ledger would not evaporate. It would be proof. When Salvatore returned to the diner the next late afternoon, his entourage thinner, his eyes a little more intent, Elena met him at the counter. He looked like a man who had carried sleep across oceans and left it on parades of smaller men. He didn't ask for her hour. He didn't offer protection like a bargain. He merely slid a small envelope across the formica toward her, the kind of movement that had nothing of threats and everything of a measured gift. Elena, who knew how to count the cost of every act, unfolded it with a caution that had been carved by necessity. Inside was a small photograph of Marco and their address on the back, a Matchbox hospital bracelet that read Marco R., and beneath it, in a hand she recognized from the earlier notes, 4 words, "Safe tonight, S." The world narrowed to the sound of her own breath. Protection signed by a Don could be a subtle form of ownership. It could also be a thin, lit bridge between two people who wanted different things from each other but were willing to pay with their names. Elena looked up to meet his eyes. There was an offering there, but also a line drawn clear as glass. He would act, she would remain sovereign. "Why?" she asked. He met her without flinching. "Because you are someone I would like to know without owing," he said simply. "And because there are men who are testing lines I can keep clean." She wanted to scoff at the poetry of the phrase. Instead, she felt, beneath the armor of her cynicism, a pulse of relief so sudden it was almost embarrassing. He did not demand her promise. He did not produce a ledger. He offered a nightly umbrella and expected nothing written in blood in return. "2 nights before a truce, you pick me up from the street," she said. "You make me safe. Tomas sends threats. Someone leaves notes. I know who writes the notes." He pronounced the name like a rumor confirmed. Tomas Belmont is tired of being second in plans he does not create. He is looking for leverage. He chose the wrong ledger. Her face must have betrayed the 1,000 small calculations in her head because Salvatore reached across the counter and for the first time in their acquaintance touched one of her scarred fingers, with a tenderness she had not expected. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Not what you think I can give. Tell me what keeps you awake." Elena's defenses had been a fortress built around a soft, stubborn core. Her life had been used by men like Tomas who believed buying fear was cheaper than earning loyalty. Salvatore offered something different, not an expanse of gold to buy her silence, but a presence that could be protective without claiming debt. It was a dangerous grace, to accept protection that did not demand the surrender of self. She wanted to believe it was possible. She wanted also not to disappoint the promises she'd made to herself in darker rooms. "In the morning," she said finally, "I will tell you the truth." He inclined his head. "Good," he said. "Truth, like grilled cheese, should be warm when it arrives." The mode of the city had shifted. Offers had been exchanged. Warnings had been attached to hands. Elena had made a choice, however tentative, to accept help without signing the ink of ownership. Salvatore had claimed, in the quiet way he knew how, that he would stand between her and the men who made threats into instruments. It was an arrangement as fragile as a whisper and as heavy as an oath. The tightrope between them had been strung. The city had noticed. Tomas had chosen to throw down a gauntlet. The detective, somewhere in his office, was starting to stitch his own maps that might use Elena as a pin. The pull between them tightened, and the choices they made now would set the terms of the coming battle. Elena's ledger had never been more volatile. Salvatore's pockets had never felt emptier of sentiment. The truce approached like a tide, and both of them were learning how to keep their feet on a moving shore. The shot came from somewhere behind the satellite hum of the city, a single, clean punctuation that tore the evening like a page ripped from a ledger. Elena dropped the plate she'd been carrying. Ceramic shattered across Formica, and the sound raised the diner to the pitch of an animal startled into motion. Screams braided with the sizzle of grease. Salvatore's men moved like a net, immediate and inhumanly practiced. The world contracted to the ring of their boots and the scent of smoke and hot oil. Elena's stomach did a private flip, and the room slid into a new geography. The booth where Salvatore had sat was empty, the napkin he'd folded clenched between 2 fingers. Then she heard Marco's name muttered in the same voice that always detoured to softness when it fell on him. She bolted toward the alley where the shots had come from, but the path was a puzzle of bodies and overturned chairs and men who were suddenly animals. She found Marco on the back stoop, sprawled with one limp arm folded awkwardly beneath him, his jacket mound still and his face flickering like a small candle put to wind. Blood made a rusty map across his tea. The sound he made when he came awake was not cry nor call, but something in between, a small animal stunned and shivering. Elena, he breathed, and her name hit the part of her that kept promises. The world abandoned its patience, and she did what she had always been trained to do. She became a conduit of immediate and necessary action. Hands that had wiped counters and folded napkins became surgeons. She ripped her apron and pressed it to the wound. Her fingers trembled, but she worked as if they were instruments she knew by number. The detective's car drew up 2 minutes later, lights off, as if shame could hide a badge. He was a man whose moral compass had always bent toward currencies he liked more than rightness. Now he slid through the chaos with the ease of someone comfortable in compromising positions. He reached the stoop, and his smile was the kind that had short cords disguised as civility. "Get him to the hospital," he said, the directive colder than any comfort. He did not help. He had a phone, and he had connections that could sew men back together if it served his narratives. Instead, he watched Elena with the ownership of a man filing evidence in a drawer he planned to open when convenient. Salvatore was at her elbow as if the air itself had arranged him there. He took Marco into his arms with an efficiency that betrayed a practice in handling ruined things back into order. Elena wanted to kill the world, and for a raging second, she wanted to kill Salvatore too. Not because he had harmed her brother, but because she did not want the world to rearrange itself under his footfalls. But he moved like a fortress. His hands were precise and instant, and he barked to his men with a voice that put hospital directions into practical motion. "Get him to Mercy General," he said. "Tell them to expect a gunshot. Call Dr. Rizzo." One of his men lifted Marco like a crate and ran, with Salvatore close beside him. Elena wanted to go, but her legs were two anchors of outrage and fear. The detective touched her arm then, a light, manipulative hold, as if he had already decided how her gratitude would be itemized. "You should be grateful," he murmured. "He could have been taken. You should let the right people know their place." Her response was a word she did not trust in the air. "Who sent the shot?" He smiled the way a man smiles when he's about to accuse. "You should be careful who you walk with," he said. "Fractures happen when loyalties shift." That was not an answer. It was a folding of intent into a threat. Elena's heart went rigid with it. She had thought the world was offering obvious dangers. Here was a danger that wore a badge and smelled faintly of certainty. At the hospital, fluorescent lights made everything pallid and exposed. Marco lay pale and brave against the high, two-white sheets. A surgeon's hands were busy making math out of blood, each stitch an equation to unsplit fate. Elena sat in a plastic chair that held cold like a rebuke, and watched Salvatore as if he were the new tide. He did not leave the room. He did not let the surgeon talk without hearing. He sat with elbows on knees, a man who had always been capable of waiting out storms. Only this time, the storm felt like a personal failure because someone else had used her to make a point. "Why him?" she demanded when the doctor stepped out and the hallway let them breathe like a wounded thing. "He was a child in the wrong place," Salvatore said. "He was in the line of fire meant for something else." "Me," she said. The accusation was soft, but it had teeth. Who was the intended target? Salvatore's jaw tightened. He had already seen the handwriting the alley left behind. "You," he said, sudden and blunt, and that cut more than any bullet. They were aiming for influence. They wanted you as leverage. She wanted to deny it, to protect the singular and raw thing inside her that refused to be used. Instead, she felt the walls of her private life collapse into a public square where men like Tomas could stand and show things like a sermon. She had allowed a man to walk beside her, and now her brother was flattened to a statistic. "You set him up," she said. Then the words felt hypocritical. She did not mean Salvatore. She meant the system. the city that palmed her and her brother like a dealer with a rapport. But Salvatore took the phrase sideways, and his eyes flashed. "You listened to him," he said, in a voice that was deceptively soft. "You took the envelope. You went home at night. You left traces." "I took the envelope because I was scared," she shot back. The confession stuck in her throat like a bone. "Because someone wanted to make me choose, and I was trying to keep Marco safe." He stood and came closer, and for a fleeting, delicate second, she wanted to let the fortress lean in. He looked more like a man who'd been injured by the world than the Don who had made empires. "You told me you would tell the truth," he said. "You promised the morning." "But you were in my doorway," she said, each word a knife. "You gave me photos and your promises and something that felt like a leash with pretty knots. Maybe you didn't ask for payment in blood, but you didn't stop other hands from writing their receipts either." His face did not change the way other men's faces did under accusation. It merely assumed a new ledger. "I tried to protect you," he said, almost like a plea. "I offered shelter, not chains." "Offers can be a trap," she whispered. "This city uses shelter the way it uses chirpy couriers to deliver poison." Her anger turned into a brittle, spreading grief when she thought of Marco's closed eyes, the little curl of his eyelashes that had always been the same since he was a baby. Salvatore watched her move through that grief like a man watching a map he would rather not read. "You're right," he said finally. "Protection from me looks like a promise. Protection from Tomas looks like leverage. There is a third dangerous thing. Men with badges, like that detective, who like to keep lists of women they can manipulate." The detective had left the room with perfect timing. He had found his leverage in the chaos. Later, when Elena remembered the way he had watched her, it would feel less like a photograph of a moment and more like a plan documented in a proper file. He had eyes that liked to temperature check fear and record its coordinates. He would turn Elena's fear into artifacts to be used later. The fractures widened. Elena had wanted to keep her promises, but the city kept rewriting the terms of those promises. She had wanted to stay sovereign. The attempt felt simultaneously noble now that Marco had bled for it. She saw Salvatore's hands. Large, sure, capable of violence and equally capable of tenderness, and thought, wildly and unwillingly, that perhaps she had traded the city's cold indifference for a man who would risk his code for her. She did not know how she felt about the trade. Fear marauded ahead of clarity. When Marco woke, his eyes found Elena first, then Salvatore's. For a toddler moment, the room simplified. Brother, sister, a man who had been there. Salvatore's hand hovered above Marco's hair, unsure whether it should ever rest there. Elena, bruised by the alley and the badge and the city's calculus, felt something inside her tilt. But the tilt carried the taste of fracture. She saw in Salvatore the inevitable choices his world required: retribution, reprisals, and an escalation that could paint their building with vendettas. She saw in Tomas the feral cleverness of a man who used the city like a chessboard. And she felt in the detective the slow, bureaucratic cruelty of someone who would file her in a case as collateral. The heartbreak came like a soft rain. It was not television drama. It was the slow, private dismantling of a life she had tried to keep intact. Elena looked at Salvatore, and for a second imagined walking away, cutting their tenuous threads before they became chains. She imagined Marco safe, and them both unseen. The simplest, most stubborn wish she'd ever had. "You could have kept him safe without putting us on a map," she said, and the words were both accusation and plea. "You offered protection, Salvatore, and that's a kindness I do not finish explaining. But kindness from you becomes a public ledger. Everyone writes on it." He looked at her with something like derailment, as if he had been holding a power that was suddenly no longer simple currency, but a dangerous commodity. "You think I wanted this?" he asked. "You think I wanted you marked?" "No," she said. "I think you wanted to be something other than what you are. I think you wanted to be a man who could do something because he cared, not because the world expected anything less." Silence folded them then, heavy as a verdict. The hospital lights hummed. Marco slept like someone who had been put back into the world by force and mercy, and Elena sat between the two men whose choices had rewritten the night. Outside, the detective smoothed his coat, eyes darting like a man who relished possibilities. Tomas would be informed. Tomas would like the sound of a wound inflicted in the right direction. The truce, once a line drawn by ink and paper, had dissolved into a terrain of personal vendettas and reputations that would be sore and messy. When they left the hospital rooms hours later, the city had aged a little more, and the distance between Elena and Salvatore had the tactile quality of a wound that had been stitched but not healed. She did not know if she could accept his protection now without feeling every inch of her autonomy compromised. He did not know if he could keep her safe without becoming the same kind of ledger that had made her life precarious in the first place. Tomas's power had shifted into a new mode. His threats no longer read like invitations and instead felt like artillery. The detective had found a new file. The city had found a new center of gossip. And Elena, tired, angry, and raw with the discovery that safety clattered like a demand, had a ledger now stained with her brother's blood. That night, Salvatore walked home alone. He had one last look at the diner, its neon a fragile heart against the world's darkness, and understood that he had not only endangered a woman he was trying to know, but had also dug a trench in the map of a war already too crowded with graves. He had protected, and yet, in protecting, had invited retaliation. Power, he had always thought, was a language he could speak without apology. Now it had become a kind of poetry, with casualties in the footnotes. Elena lay awake on a couch that had never seemed so small and realized the fragile arithmetic she had been living by was unsustainable. She had refused to be bait, but the world had made a new trap out of her refusal, a narrative that required her to choose between isolation and an allegiance that might cost her everything. The fragments of her trust sat on a shelf like broken dishes she could not afford to throw away. Somewhere in the city, Tomas planned his next move. Somewhere, the detective cataloged her fear. When she opened the dregs of the small photograph Salvatore had given her, Marco's hospital tag, folded and now smudged with tears, she felt the ledger inside her slide. Secrets had split their seams, and fractures were propagating. The choice ahead of her would not be one of simple survival. It would be a decision about what kind of life she would permit for herself and for the boy who loved comic books and burned his pancakes. She would have to choose what she was willing to lose to have him breathe another morning. And in that choice, the first real cracks of love would reveal whether it could survive the city's appetite for payment. They moved like predators learning a new scent. Elena did not wait for permission. The ledger in her head, parcels of what to do, who to call, which corners to avoid, folded itself into a single furious map. She had been a woman who waited and counted and bartered silence for safety. When Marco bled for that patience, patience felt like cowardice. Salvatore watched her with that split expression she was still learning to read, part calculation, part astonishment, then stepped into the motion beside her with an ease that made the city shift around them. "We take Tomas before he knows the wound he made," Elena said. Her voice was small and steady and held the brittle fervor of someone who had decided to stop being collateral. "He gambled on making you a problem and me the price. I won't be either." Salvatore's mouth tightened. He had men who would have torn Tomas apart on sight, men whose loyalty had been bought and baptized in a different kind of fear. But this was not about buying retribution. This was about stopping a man from using her brother as a language. He could have offered to bury Tomas in the usual way, public, vicious, a message that would settle for a season. Instead, he regarded Elena, and the idea of that kind of violence made something in him recoil. He wanted an end that did not turn her into a spectacle. "No public blood," he said. "We end this differently." They built the plan in half sentences and practiced patience like a weapon. Elena would bait the trap herself. She would walk into Tomas's booth that night and be everything she had been trained not to be, visible and defiant. Salvatore would not stand on the sidewalk like a looming shadow. He would move through the city's veins in ways that left no body in a morgue for gossip to hold. He would break codes, call in favors that smelled of debt already paid, and fracture Tomas's reach without splattering the board with crude gestures. "You're willing to risk your ledger for me," Elena said, and it sounded like a question, even as it landed like a confession. "I'm willing to risk my ledger for the life of a boy with pancakes burnt into his childhood," Salvatore replied. "For the woman who refused to let herself be bait. For the people I've told myself I do not have the right to want. Risk is part of the accounting." That night, the diner was a theater of low lights and dangerous expectations. Tomas arrived with the casual menace of a man rehearsed for domination. He had polished shoes and quiet threats that fit neatly into his pockets. He smiled at Elena when she took his order, the way someone smiles at a thing they plan to break. "You should be grateful for the concern," he purred. "Not everyone gets notes like the ones you found. Consider yourself wanted." Elena sat with her spine like iron and her voice an instrument. She spoke truths that weren't hers to tell and truths that were. That Marco had always been fierce at 14. That threats were poor investments. That men who used children to broker favors went extinct in the wrong century. Tomas's grin thinned. He didn't expect resistance that smelled so much like resolve. He expected everyone to rearrange themselves around his appetite. He did not expect Salvatore's response. Without fanfare, no gun flash, no brutal command, Salvatore walked in with 2 men and a lawyer who owed him from an old favor. The lawyer took a seat opposite Tomas and spoke in tones that sounded like municipal law. He had documents. He had witnesses willing to place Tomas in transactions that didn't suit his public image. Illegal land deals, police bribes, an accountant's ledger that could be made into a public river. Tomas's face hardened the way rust hardens metal. He rose like a man who'd been backed into a reputation and only then realized the cost. Salvatore's men were not there to tear him down physically. They were there to dismantle the scaffolding that allowed Tomas to buy people like Elena. Power could be removed not only by blood, but by exposure, by turning a capo's leverage into a vulnerability measurable in court and in the precincts that still cared for public opinion. "You won't win," Tomas spat, but his voice had no teeth for the lawyer's stack of paper and the detective's sudden, controlled interest. The detective watched, but his file, once a tool, became a shackle. Exposure threatened the badge as much as the capo. It was not a clean victory. Tomas lashed, sending men to the back alley to break windows and to make noises suggestive of retaliation. One tried to take a swing at Elena. Salvatore moved like someone who chooses where the storm will break. He stepped in, a shield of broad shoulders and controlled violence. He did not kill the man. He dislocated his arm with a precise brutality that left the assailant howling and useful to no one. The room closed around the outcome the way a fist closes, quick and irrevocable. The detective, watching his leverage evaporate under sunlight and legal pressure, made a choice that declared him both coward and opportunist. He tried to gather the remaining pieces, threats, rumors, but with the lawyer's paperwork and Salvatore's cultivated pressure, his threats dissolved into the paperwork of his own compromised career. He would resurface later, somewhere with a lighter conscience and a paler badge, but tonight he was contained. When Tomas slunk away, humiliated, not dead, but with his scheming shelved in the court of men who still feared legal consequences, Salvatore stood with a quiet that felt like a benediction. Elena's legs gave out under the weight of adrenaline and exhaustion, and she sagged into his side. "You did it," she breathed, and the words were a map of gratitude and a map of fear. "You stopped him." "I didn't stop him," Salvatore corrected, the comment measuring out like a confession. "I offered you a way to stop him. You walked into the room. You did this." She found the truth of that like an ember, hot and alive and belonging to her. It had been her courage that had risked a public scene, and her unwillingness to be passive bait that had turned the tide. Salvatore had rearranged the rules to give her the chance. That rearrangement had been his sacrifice, not of life, but of empire's small, secure tyrannies. He had chosen legality and leverage and shame as weapons over guns and graves. They walked back to the diner in a silence shifted by the recent violence. Salted wind carried the smell of fried onions and something like relief. When they reached the stoop of Elena's building, she turned to him in the half-light, and the city seemed to hold its breath. "I could walk away," she said, testing the phrase like a coin to learn its weight. "I could go somewhere with Marco and live small, and maybe that would be safer." "Safer doesn't mean whole," Salvatore said, "and leaving marks, you make only certain kinds of wounds. If you go, you take the memory of this with you, the ups and downs of it. If you stay, you take the work. Both are honest." She closed her eyes and thought of Marco's comic books, of his laugh, of his small, stubborn bravery. She thought of the hospital lights and of the detective's watchful face. She thought, suddenly and irrevocably, of the way Salvatore's hand had rested on her scarred finger earlier that week, not as ownership, but as an offering. "I don't want to be indebted," she said. "Not to you, not to anyone." He stepped closer, until the air between them was the width of a promise. "Then don't be," he said. "Walk beside me as an equal. I will not write your name in my books. I will sign my name to a protection I will not call a debt, but you'll have to take the risk of being seen with me." Her laugh was small and bittersweet. "That's a dangerous kind of freedom." "It is the only kind I know how to keep," he replied. She weighed the scarred lines on her palm with the scarred map in her chest, and chose. She let her hand find his, not because she needed a guardian, but because she was choosing a partner in a city that favored alliances written in blood. His fingers closed around hers with a tenderness that was a governance unto itself, a promise that he would act and a surrender that she would too. Not to him, with him. They stood on the stoop, two people who had learned to plead not with silence, but with action. The city hummed around them, a beast that liked to be fed tales of supremacy and loss. Elena lifted her chin. "We rebuild," she said, "not with gold, not with threats, but with the things that keep us whole." Salvatore nodded. "We rebuild with grilled cheese and guarded nights, and a law that won't always be mine to enforce." They sealed the pact with a kiss that tasted of grease and adrenaline and the strange sweetness of survival. It was not a romantic movie kind of end, but a realist thing. Messy, necessary, mutually sacrificial. Elena felt the press of his lips and heard the city exhale. For once, power did not glitter. It was a hand offered and a hand taken in the dark. Behind them, the diner glowed like a small, stubborn heart. Inside, the jukebox sputtered and a waitress dried the counter and counted the placings of plates. Outside, the truce had been shifted from a paper promise to a living negotiation. They had bought, with nothing more than courage and some of Salvatore's old capital, a reprieve, a new ledger whose ink would be written in shared scars and deliberate kindnesses. If the city wanted a war, it would get a negotiation instead, messy, human, and infinitely harder to narrate in headlines. Elena and Salvatore walked up the steps together, hands intertwined, the map of their lives redrawn with a single, dangerous line between them. It was not safety, it was not purity. It was a choice, a claim, and under the jaundiced glow of the street lamp, their shadows braided into something like a promise. They slept in fits and starts that first night after Tomas slunk away, the kind of sleep that leaves you warm in one place and cold in all the rest. In the morning, Marco's appetite was the first honest thing to return. Pancakes, slightly burned at the edges because he insisted on doing them himself, a small ceremony of survival. Elena watched him from the doorway, the domestic scene a fragile altar she had not expected to build with a man whose name had been printed in the obituaries of so many lives. Salvatore moved through their apartment like someone learning a new language. He boiled water exactly the way Marco liked it for Coco. He folded laundry clumsily and then learned the arc of a shirt so it would look cared for without fuss. He did not announce himself with men or mandates. He arrived with small, useful things. A doctor's private number, a promise that the detective's file would languish in a desk where sunlight could not reach it, a quiet arrangement with the landlord so that no anonymous envelope could become a ploy to evict them. For Elena, these were not gifts so much as recalibrations of power, soft, deliberate, and shockingly human. They rebuilt in the slow math of trust. Elena reclaimed chores and bills, teaching Salvatore how to roll coins without flinching at the metallic sounds he once used to tally debts. Salvatore began to understand the tenor of a life that wasn't accounted for in ledgers for favors, but in due dates and piano recitals and the small domestic catastrophes of a boy who refused to fold his socks straight. Each act of ordinary care felt revolutionary between them. Each concession a new clause in a contract no one had the right to sign for them. Tomas retreated into rumor, his threats turned hollow by the exposure Salvatore had engineered. The detective's appetite for leverage shrank beneath the weight of legal tapers and a few well-placed reminders of legacy. They did not celebrate. The streets were too honest for triumph. Instead, they marked time, an unceremonious ritual of surviving one morning after another. One evening, weeks later, Elena locked the diner and walked out with Salvatore at her side. The city had not forgiven them. It never would. But the neon that had seemed to judge them now blinked like a tired but loyal friend. Marco waved from the window with a comic folded under his arm and a grin that made the rest of the world manageable. On the stoop where they had first sealed their fragile pact, Elena reached for Salvatore's hand. They had both been remade, scarred certainly, but differently. No promises were exchanged that could be cataloged in a capo's book. They leaned into one another, to keep making breakfasts, to answer the phone at night, to stand in the messy middle where love and danger met, and to refuse the city's appetite for spectacle. They leaned into one another beneath the street lamp, a tripod of shadow, two bodies and a boy who belonged to both of them in ways neither had anticipated. The city hummed, indifferent and alive. Their silhouettes bloomed long and honest across the pavement. Elena pressed her forehead to Salvatore's and felt, absurdly and perfectly, like someone learning at last how to hold a map and a compass at the same time. The night swallowed them softly, not with a roar, but with the small, steady sound of two people choosing one another again and again. The neon buzzed like an old song, and the diner's heart kept beating, warm, stubborn, and unexpectedly steady, while their shadows braided into a quieter kind of promise that would be harder to break than any ledger.